Good afternoon. This is Ben Woodbury with the New Mexico History Museum's Friends of History. We'd like to welcome you to the August presentation for the ongoing Friends of History First Wednesday lecture series. As you know, we are currently presenting these lectures online during this COVID-19 pandemic. We're fortunate to have with us today Matthew Babcock. Matt is an associate professor of history at the University of North Texas in Dallas. He received his BA from Dartmouth, his MA from the University of New Mexico, and his PhD from Southern Methodist University. His presentation today is drawn from his 2016 publication, Apache Adaptation to Hispanic Rule, which was published by Cambridge University Press. His research focuses on the history of the North American borderlands, American Indians, and the colonial Southwest. Today's lecture will focus on the forgotten Chihene Apache farming experience at Sabinal, New Mexico, from 1790 to 1795. Placing it in the context of Apache-Spanish relations and Spanish-Indian policy during the period. In response to drought and military pressure, thousands of Apaches de Paz settled near Spanish presidios after 1786 in a system of reservation-like settlements stretching from Laredo to Tucson. On paper, these settlements constituted the earliest and most extensive set of military-run reservations in the Americas. And you will see through the discussion the number of parallels with U.S. government efforts to establish similar reservations after the Civil War while addressing what was then perceived as the Indian problem. The Apaches who did settle in the Spanish settlements exhibited mixed loyalties, sometimes serving Spanish interests and other times subverting them, demonstrating the limits of indigenous assimilation into imperial states. Before we start, I want to mention that following this presentation, we will have a question and answer period with Professor Babcock. And if you have questions, please feel free to place them in the chat section below either your Facebook screening or your YouTube screening. Without further ado, here is Dr. Babcock. Enjoy the presentation.
I want to begin by thanking Ben Woodbury for the opportunity to speak with you today. This talk is drawn from research, most of which comes from my book, Apache Adaptation to Hispanic Rule, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. After negotiating preliminary terms with New Mexico Governor Fernando de la Concha in Santa Fe in late 1789, the following July, the four Chihene Ende Nantans, Hasquanelte, Hans Quiadecho, Hans Hesny, and Nazbachonil, whom Spaniards called Gileño and Membrano Apache leaders, signed a peace treaty on behalf of their kinsmen residing in mountain ranges stretching across most of today's southern New Mexico, from Zuni Pueblo in the northwest to El Paso del Norte, or modern Ciudad Juarez, in the southeast. In late May 1791, Hasquanelte, a resident of the San Mateo Mountains, whom Concha named General, had relocated 18 ranchos of his people from the San Mateo, Gila, and Mimbres ranges to within half a league of Sabinal Pueblo, a Rio Grande farming community located south of Belen, which you can see here on this map. For 4 straight years, these Chihenes seasonally farmed near Sabinal during the growing season using Spanish farming implements and the existing acequias for irrigation. After meeting with the Apaches at Sabinal in late April 1792, the governor reported that the two groups resided in separate settlements on either side of the Rio Grande, and in an effort to ensure that the Indians complied with the treaty terms, that vecinos from the Rio Abajo district were assisting the Chihenes in sowing 3 cornfields. By December, Sabinal's close to 300 Apache residents were receiving a small weekly ration of maize at the king's expense. Despite Sabinal's brief existence as an Apache reservation, Governor Concha's agricultural experiment is noteworthy for several reasons. Here is a rare case where Spanish efforts to get Apaches to farm actually worked, reflecting the high level of accommodation that at least some Apaches and Spaniards reached in this era, and Apaches could draw on their experience in their future dealings with Mexicans and Americans. The Chihenes at Sabinal were not alone. A prolonged regional drought and coordinated attacks from Spanish troops and their Indian allies influenced thousands of Apaches to relocate and resettle in a group of reservation-like establecimientos near Spanish presidios beginning in 1786. Stretching for more than 900 miles at its height in the late 1790s, from Laredo in the east to Tucson in the west, this little-known Spanish experiment constituted the earliest and most extensive system of military reservations in the Americas. By the 1790s, approximately 2,000 of an estimated 11,500 Apaches had settled on at least 12 reservations across the Southwest, including at least 50% of the Mescaleros and a group that I'm calling Southern Apaches, who most Americans are more familiar with as Chiricahuas, of which the Chihenes were a part. Spaniards established their presidios or military garrisons along the river valleys, from which they tried to assert control over the region. Meanwhile, independent Apaches, who called themselves Inde, or the people, controlled a vast territory of their own. Inde Apache country, which Spaniards called the Gran Apacheria, comprised most of modern Texas, New Mexico, eastern Arizona, and upland and arid portions of Coahuila, Nueva Vizcaya, and Sonora. This well-established elastic space overlapped the emerging Comancheria or Comanche country, which has received much more attention from scholars. Its boundaries extended from the Colorado, the boundaries of the Apacheria or Inde extended from the Colorado River in the east 700 miles westward to the Middle Gila River, and from the Mogollon Mountains in Texas Hill Country in the north to the Sierra Madre and Bolson de Mapimí in the south. We might think of the Comanches as being the largest north to south indigenous power in the Southwest at this time, but the Apaches were the largest east to west power, indigenous power in this same period. Many Americans would be shocked to learn that the families of well-known chiefs or Nantans, from Mangas Colorados to Cochise, and eventually even Geronimo, lived within this system. Some of the most favored Apache headmen resided inside the presidio walls with their entire extended families. Like missionaries, presidial commanders hoped to turn Apaches into Spaniards. Instead of making religious conversion the heart of their program, however, military officers first hoped to make Apaches dependent on Spanish foods and material goods in an effort to turn them into sedentary farmers. At the establecimientos, then, Christianization was the last step in the acculturation process instead of the first. It seems clear to me that from the perspective of the Spanish military, these were, in fact, reservations. Every week, Spanish officers recorded the rations and supplies that they issued to Apaches in an account book. Every month, commanding officers, such as in the document from Pedro de Nava, the 1791 document you see here on the screen, commanding officers recorded the total number of Apaches in each band, noting marital status, gender, and age. Most importantly, in 1791, Commander-in-Chief of the Interior Provinces, Pedro de Nava, ordered that, quote, the territory that each rancheria occupies should be specified, as well as the distance from the principal post, end quote. If Apaches left their specified boundaries for any reason, they had to obtain a written passport from the commander. Why then would Inde ever agree to such terms and sign these treaties? Apaches settled near presidios for essentially the same reasons that they and native peoples across colonial North America settled in missions. To Inde, presidios and surrounding reservation lands were potentially resource-rich zones of safety, which they could utilize like trading posts. Apaches, especially women and children, sought protection from Spanish troops and Indian enemies, who included Comanches, Utes, Pueblos, Opatas, and Pimas. Their enemies at this time also included a portion of the Athabascan-speaking Navajos, who were serving as Spanish allies. And for independent Apaches, Apaches de Paz could potentially hunt them down as well. So Spaniards were using the classic divide and conquer tactics that dated back to Cortez, and they made the strategic choice to ally with Comanches rather than Apaches. They regarded Apaches as their arch enemies. And so Spaniards and their Indian allies targeted Apaches themselves and their resources, their camps, their horses, and their crops. Inde women especially were interested in safely accessing seasonal harvest locales for mescal and other wild plants that they gathered. Second, Apaches sought as many material benefits within the system as Spaniards were willing to offer them. These consisted of food rations, gifts, spoils from battle, trading privileges in neighboring pueblos, and most importantly, from an Inde perspective, the recovery of captured kinsmen. In return, Apaches agreed to return their Spanish-born captives and unbranded livestock, stop their raids into Spanish territory, and help Spaniards defeat other independent Apache groups. Lastly, Apaches realized that they could manipulate the system to further serve their needs. Inde headmen began to do this from the very moment they negotiated peace agreements with Spanish officers by attempting to work as many treaty terms as possible in their favor. Subverting Spanish efforts to make them sedentary farmers subject to Crown authority, the Inde would adapt to reservation life by remaining at least semi-sedentary and using Spanish rations, gifts, and military protection to sustain and preserve their families. Getting back to Sabinal, Governor Concha's decision to resettle Apaches there also provoked some controversy from a Spanish policy standpoint. As early as 1788, both Comanche leaders and Commander-in-Chief of the Interior Provinces, Jacobo Ugarte, voiced their displeasure with admitting Apaches to peace in New Mexico. Comanches, who had forged an alliance with New Mexico Governor Juan Bautista de Anza in 1786, complained that they would have no enemies to fight if Spaniards granted Apaches peace in the province. Ugarte, fearing the disruption of the Comanche alliance on the one hand and a lack of Apache compliance on the other, forbade New Mexico's governors from making peace with any Apache. Now, Concha was still able to proceed with his Sabinal experiment, however, because Viceroy Manuel Antonio Flores and Ugarte's successor, Pedro de Nava, supported it. Indeed, Concha's predecessor, Governor Anza, he too had established a precedent for resettling mobile equestrian native groups in agricultural settlements by ordering the establishment of the short-lived San Carlos de los Jupes, northeast of Santa Fe, on the Arkansas River in 1787. Together with Spanish laborers from Taos, Jupe Comanches built and occupied 19 houses by mid-September of that year before abruptly abandoning the community in January 1788, following the death of one of the wives of their leader, Parawan Aramuco. According to the terms of the 1790 Sabinal Treaty, the Apaches de Paz were supposed to warn Governor Concha of enemy Indians entering the province. They were to serve Spanish interests as auxiliaries against the Mescaleros in Sierra Blanca, and they were not to carry out raids in El Paso or the Nueva Vizcaya and Sonoran frontiers, or they would not be admitted to peace. In exchange, Concha promised to furnish them with seeds, farming tools, and agricultural plots along the banks of the Rio Grande, and to have vecinos teach and help them to farm, as had been done with the Navajos and Jicarillas, whose example he hoped they would follow. Now, the extent of the peace with southwestern native peoples at this time is certainly significant. In New Mexico alone, Apaches de Paz were joining the Navajos, Jicarillas, Utes, and Comanches as Spanish allies, and Concha reported that all of these nations remained faithfully at peace through the fall of 1790, which in the case of the Gila Apaches surprised him. So part of the reason for the Gila compliance was undoubtedly the frequent gifts that Governor Concha bestowed on Gila leaders who visited him in Santa Fe. In November, he reported that they had witnessed the frequent exchanges between Gila rancherias without any trickery or bad faith. The frequency of these gifts for Gila headmen and auxiliaries increased by the summer of 1793, and the overall expenses on gifts for Indians in New Mexico rose annually through at least 1795. As of late February 1791, the only significant Apache raiding occurring in New Mexico was being carried out by independent Apaches targeting El Paso del Norte from the Robledo Mountains. And these raids continued sporadically during the ensuing spring and summer. But in May 1791, the Sabinal Apaches were implicated when an Indian from Hasquenalte's rancheria was wounded while trying to steal the El Paso del Norte horse herd. At the time, Hasquenalte's people were camped well south of Sabinal in the Paraje del Perillo, a water source along the Camino Real east of the Rio Grande in modern Doña Ana County between Truth or Consequences and Socorro. By late May, however, Concha reported the order had been restored and Capitan Hasquenalte and 18 ranchos of his people from the Gila and Mimbres Mountains were residing half a league from Sabinal on the banks of the Rio Grande, where they sowed crops, utilizing the existing acequias. On May 28th, Hasquenalte demonstrated his compliance with the 1790 Sabinal Treaty terms by warning Governor Concha that Mescaleros were going to attack the village of Tomé within 3 to 4 days, which provided Concha with the time to have additional Isleta Pueblo Indians and vecinos reinforce that community. In mid-April 1792, in an effort to further encourage Apache farming, Governor Concha personally met with the Gila and Mimbres Apaches in a 4-day conference at Sabinal. Concha tried to convince the groups to live together in two populations, with one band situated in the current location 2 leagues from Sabinal, Vecinos from the Rio Abajo district would build them jacales, or huts, and supply them with livestock for breeding. Since Concha was not convinced that these Apaches would honor the peace when left alone, he had them immediately begin sowing 3 cornfields under close supervision. The following April, the Apaches de Paz at Sabinal asked Governor Concha for a passport to harvest mezcal, which he granted them on the condition that they return to Sabinal by May 1st to plant their accustomed crops, which they apparently did. In December of 1793, Concha reported that Apaches de Paz camped near Sabinal were committing small hostilities. And in October 1794, Governor Concha's successor, Fernando de Chacon, reported that Planchillas and 3 other leaders among the Apaches de Paz at Sabinal were lacking good faith. In mid-November, Chacon reported that the headman Campanita and his people had left Sabinal, but that Planchillas and 3 other leaders still remained. Apaches de Paz were engaged in 2 diametrically opposed processes of Hispanicization on the one hand and adaptation on the other at Sabinal and at other Spanish-run reservations. Although a small number of Apaches did adopt Hispanic cultural traits, very few did so exactly as Spanish officials intended. The best examples of Hispanicization among reservation-dwelling Apaches were the Chaconan headman El Compa and his son Nayolchi, or Juan Diego Compa, at Janos. These were the only 2 known Apache families to live inside a Spanish presidio with Spanish soldiers, and this continued for several decades at Janos. Certainly also a key and unique establecimiento. El Compa's other son, Huscaye, or Juan Jose Compa, who's familiar also in the American period of New Mexico history, was fluent and fully literate in Spanish. Some Apache children did become full-fledged members of Spanish frontier society by living in Spanish households or in Indian missions. But baptizing Apache children was not always a sign of their Hispanicization, given that Apache parents commonly requested baptism as a last resort for their children when they were on the verge of death from disease. In the late colonial period, Spanish officers routinely shipped the most bellicose Apache men and women to Mexico City as prisoners of war. A small number of women worked as laborers in Spanish businesses from Chihuahua to Mexico City, and some of the men worked on fortifications in Havana, Cuba, alongside Spanish convicts. The vast majority of extradited Apache prisoners, however, either escaped back to the frontier or died from malnutrition, fatigue, and disease, and thus did not assimilate. Most Apaches de Paz found ways to adapt creatively to retain their cultural independence. Rather than a radical step towards civilization, Apaches tended to view settlement on reservations as an opportunity to fulfill temporary needs and circumvent the overambitious incorporation attempts of Spanish officials. Peaceful Apache headmen and interpreters frequently started rumors of Apache revolts, and the most influential peaceful Apache leaders also used their diplomatic prowess to negotiate for release of Apache captives and prisoners. Apaches de Paz also utilized Spanish rations and gifts for their own purposes. Typically, when Spanish officials gave them livestock for breeding in an effort to reduce the cost of rations and promote self-sufficiency, the Apaches simply consumed all of the animals. Year after year, peaceful Apaches confounded Spanish officials by either consuming their entire weekly food rations on the first day of issue, or selling, trading, and gambling their food rations and clothing away to Spanish settlers and returning naked to their reservations. Such behavior not only frustrated Spanish priests and military officers, it also quickly drove up the costs of the system. Another Apache adaptation was allegedly adopting the vices and rebellious excesses of frontier Spaniards and mission Indians, which included gambling, dancing, and swearing. Apache-Spanish frequently played cards with Spanish settlers and mission Indians, and they also made their own painted leather card decks using horsehide, which includes the cards that you see here for the game of Monte. So these are Apache versions of the Two of Coins, the King of Swords, and the Caballero of Coins. So these are Hispanic designs, but they contain original Apache motifs. And the cards that you see here date a little bit later than the time period I'm talking about, in the period of between 1840 and 1890. According to Franciscan reports, Spanish subjects simply corrupted Apaches rather than helping them to acculturate in any morally acceptable way. But some instances, such as betting on foot racing at Tucson, may have been cases of reciprocal acculturation or Apacheization of Spaniards adopting Apache traits. Not surprisingly, the most important way Apaches adapted to living at reservations was by moving off of them, which they did for a whole host of reasons. These included visiting relatives on other reservations or in the Apacheria, avoiding disease outbreaks, hunting and small-scale livestock raiding, and revenge raids against Spanish troops for attacking their independent kinsmen. And Apaches would especially be angry if the Spaniards were targeting neutral bands. To the Spaniards, every Apache was either at war or peace. They didn't always recognize neutrality as a third option that Apaches had. Given the amount of resistance and adaptation that especially Apache men were engaged in, this was an extremely fragile and uneasy peace, even from a Spanish perspective. But we can still identify three reciprocal benefits that Apaches and Spaniards experienced from the 1790s through the 1820s under this system. First, the reduction and compartmentalization of Apache raids on the one hand and Spanish military offenses on the other helped to reduce violence in the region. Second, the system helped produce several decades of Spanish economic, demographic, and northward territorial expansion, where the Spanish-Apache peace was most enduring west of the Rio Grande, in western Nueva Vizcaya, Sonora, and parts of New Mexico. Third was an unintended consequence for Spaniards. It enabled Apaches to rebuild their war-ravaged culture and eventually reassert their cultural independence. The truth is that this system began to decline much earlier and more unevenly than many scholars have asserted east of the Rio Grande, and it did so well before the Mexican War for Independence in the 1810s. The Lapons were on the fringe of the system to begin with, and in February 1794, Mescaleros were the first pacified group to try to reassert their cultural independence when they deserted their reservations at El Paso del Norte and San Elizario in protest of Spanish punitive expeditions against their independent relatives. And they would form an alliance with Inde groups west of the Rio Grande and fight against Spaniards until at least 1799. In response to the Mescalero uprising, the lack of farming by at least most Apache-Spanish, and also Spain's draining war with the French Republic from 1793 through 95, Commander-in-Chief Pedro de Nava decided to ban Apaches from visiting him in Chihuahua. He also required them to settle 30 leagues from Spanish presidios and settlements, and he reduced their rations. His decisions clearly hastened the collapse of Sabinal, which is poorly understood. Previous scholars have mistakenly argued that Comanches destroyed the reservation or that it gradually withered away because Spaniards lost interest in fostering it. For nearly a decade after the Spanish-influenced breakup of the Chihene Dine or Navajo alliance in October of 1786, Navajos, not Comanches, were the major indigenous threat to Chihenes. Navajo's repeated killing of Chihene adults and capturing of small children, including the treacherous assassination of Nantan Napachuli, who is also known as Tecolote or Owl, and 8 other Chihene men during peace negotiations in the Dineta, or Navajo homeland, in July 1791, did not ruin Sabinal either. Instead, this violence was likely a major reason that so many Chihene families relocated to the Rio Grande community under General Hasquinalte's leadership from 1790 to 94 in the first place. In the fall of 1793, independent Chihenes successfully avenged Napachuli's assassination and subsequent Navajo attacks in their camps in the San Mateo Mountains by attacking them 40 leagues from Laguna Pueblo in the Paraje de Guadalupe and killing General Antonio El Pinto. Governor Concha's own deteriorating health and changes in Spanish policy, not Comanche or Navajo-initiated violence, were major factors precipitating Sabinal's collapse in late 1794. Suffering from a key eye injury that had plagued him for at least 3 years and left him permanently disabled, Governor Concha left office in the late fall of 1793 and rode south with the pack train to Chihuahua, where he became a patient at the Army Hospital. His successor, Fernando de Chacon, who profoundly mistrusted Apaches, opposed Concha's efforts and offered no support to the Sabinal Apaches. Taking advantage of Concha's departure and his own late October policy change in Nueva Vizcaya, in December of 1794, Commander-in-Chief Nava ordered Governor Chacon to have the Apaches at Sabinal and any other Indios de Paz in New Mexico to settle 30 leagues from Spanish presidios and settlements to remain independent and be subject to Spanish attack. Although scholars have suggested that Apaches never returned to Sabinal after 1794, that too is not the case. In May of 1795, 16 Apache families remained at peace near the Pueblo, and throughout the spring, Chacon, following Nava's orders much more closely than Concha usually did, repeatedly rebuffed Apache emissaries requesting to return there. When an Apache woman carrying a cross requested peace at Sabinal in late July and complained of Spanish attacks on her people, who had done nothing wrong, Sandia Pueblo auxiliaries seized her and tried to bring her to Santa Fe. After she escaped near the Sandia Mountains, the auxiliaries hunted her down, killed her, and presented her severed ears to Governor Chacon. Meanwhile, former Apaches de Paz from Sabinal, most likely in concert with their independent kinsmen, responded to the Spanish policy of removal and escalation of violence toward them by defiantly camping inside of Nava's 30-league limit and boldly striking settlements in the Laguna, Albuquerque, and Tomé districts of New Mexico. Across the Spanish frontier during the 1790s, a minority of Apaches de Paz worked together with Spaniards to reduce violence in the region by serving as scouts and auxiliaries, while the majority relied on movement, trading, and small-scale livestock raiding, which Spanish soldiers and settlers were supposed to tolerate because, in the words of Viceroy Bernardo de Galvez, a bad peace is better than a good war. These dual strategies caused confusion, disruptions and results that Spanish policymakers never intended, but that does not mean that the establecimientos were a failure. Instead, they enabled the system to endure and function largely on in-day terms in the in-day to reassert their political and territorial sovereignty by 1832. Yet the power balance between Apaches and Spaniards in the late 18th century was very even. The chief material benefit Apaches obtained from Spaniards from 1778 to 1795 was stolen livestock. Apaches captured more than 23,000 Spanish horses, mules, and cattle, with Spaniards recovering less than half of them at almost 9,000. The chief material benefit Spaniards obtained from Apaches were Apache captives and prisoners, especially women and children. You can see a huge disparity there, 1,254 versus 78. Now, the killing was virtually even on both sides, 1,089 Apaches to 929 Spaniards. So this was not an absolute Spanish military victory by any means, and we can get some understanding on the negotiating that was taking place here with the potential for Apaches to exchange stolen livestock for Spanish-held captive Apaches, explaining a lot of the peace agreements. But not necessarily all of them. And indeed, the Sabinal peace treaty and subsequent resettlement remain unique because of the extent of Apache farming that did occur there. And 60 years later, during the 1850s, Chihene, Mimbres, and Ojo Caliente Nantans, including Mangas Coloradas and Baishan, or Cuchillo Negro, who you see here in this painting, would draw on this prior experience at the establecimientos by negotiating similar accords with Indian agent Michael Steck and Governor David Meriwether in New Mexico, raising hundreds of acres of corn along the Mimbres and Gila rivers. What Inde would succeed in retaining during this brutally violent period from the 1830s to the 1850s, following the collapse of the establecimientos, was the vast majority of their homeland. Now, obviously, this would change during the 1860s, but this is an interesting development of a equestrian mobile group reasserting their cultural independence and returning to their homeland for a 30-year period. In the interest of time, I think I'll wrap things up there and just leave you with an image of my book, again, Apache Adaptation to Hispanic Rule, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. It's available through Amazon or through Cambridge, the Cambridge website. Thank you very much, and I do look forward to answering some of your questions.